At the beginning, a narcissistic woman often lives under the illusion that people are easily replaceable. In her mind, relationships are not sacred bonds, but interchangeable roles. She believes that the attention, patience, and loyalty you offered were not unique qualities of character, but simply things any other man could provide. This belief is not born from clarity, but from an inflated sense of self. When someone sees themselves as exceptional, they naturally assume that others are abundant and disposable. Because of this mindset, the quiet sacrifices you made rarely register in the moment. Your patience during conflict, your consistency when things were unstable, and your willingness to understand her emotional storms are all interpreted as ordinary. What she fails to see is that these qualities are not ordinary at all. They are rare expressions of emotional maturity. Psychologically, this illusion protects the narcissistic ego. If she admitted the true value of what you offered, she would also have to confront her own dependence on it. And dependence is something the narcissistic personality fears deeply. So she convinces herself that the world is full of replacements, that better options are always waiting. Yet life has a way of revealing truths that the ego tries to hide. And sooner or later, reality asks a simple question. If he was so replaceable, why is his absence so difficult to replace? What truly disrupts this illusion is not confrontation, not anger, and not dramatic exits. It is silence. When a man finally stops arguing, stops explaining himself, and most importantly, stops chasing something subtle but powerful shifts in the psychological dynamic. For a long time, the narcissistic woman may have relied on his reactions as a form of emotional confirmation. Every message, every attempt to fix things, every effort to be understood kept the connection alive in a way that served her need for attention and control. But the moment that pursuit disappears, the familiar rhythm collapses. The absence of reaction becomes unsettling. Silence removes the mirror she used to measure her influence. Without it, she begins to face something she rarely encounters: uncertainty. Psychologically, silence creates a void, and the human mind has a natural tendency to fill empty spaces with questions. Why did he stop? Where did his attention go? Why does he no longer respond the way he once did? These questions begin to echo in the quiet places of the mind. Ironically, the very thing she once took for granted, his constant presence, becomes most noticeable when it is gone. The silence speaks louder than any argument ever could, because sometimes the most powerful message a person can send is the one that requires no words at all. Time has a peculiar way of revealing value. While someone is present, consistent, and available, their presence can become almost invisible. The mind adapts quickly to stability, and what once felt meaningful begins to feel ordinary. For a narcissistic woman, this effect can be even stronger because her attention is often directed toward novelty, admiration, and emotional stimulation rather than quiet reliability. But once the man she overlooked is no longer there, comparison quietly begins. New people may enter her life, conversations may continue, attention may still exist, but something feels different. The emotional depth is not the same. The patience she once received so freely now seems rare. The sense of safety, the feeling that someone truly understood her patterns, slowly becomes something she cannot easily recreate. Psychologically, This is the moment when perception begins to shift. What once appeared ordinary starts to reveal itself as uncommon. Genuine loyalty, emotional steadiness, and the willingness to stay through difficulty are qualities that cannot simply be replaced by charm or surface level attention. And this realization often arrives too late, because the person who carried those qualities may have already moved forward with his life. Value is rarely recognized in the moment it is given. It is usually understood only after its absence creates a silence nothing else can truly fill. Another shift begins to happen when the man she once relied on emotionally is no longer participating in the dynamic. In relationships shaped by narcissistic patterns, attention is not just appreciated, it becomes a form of psychological fuel. The admiration, the reassurance, the emotional reactions, even the arguments all serve as confirmation of influence. They reinforce a quiet sense of control. But when the man steps away and stops providing that emotional energy, the system begins to break down. The reactions she once triggered so easily no longer appear. The predictable cycle of tension and reassurance disappears. And with that disappearance comes something unfamiliar, the loss of control over the emotional environment. Control, in many ways, is the hidden foundation of narcissistic behavior. When that foundation weakens, frustration and curiosity often emerge. She may begin to check for signs of his attention, wonder whether he is thinking about her, or question why her usual strategies no longer work. What once felt like a secure position of power suddenly feels uncertain. And uncertainty has a way of awakening awareness. Because when someone who once revolved around you chooses to walk their own path, it forces a realization that control was never as permanent as it seemed. And sometimes the moment control disappears is the moment true value finally becomes visible. As time passes, another subtle psychological process begins to unfold. Human memory is not a perfect record of events. It is something the mind quietly reshapes over time. When a relationship ends, especially one that once provided emotional stability, the mind begins to revisit the past with a different perspective. In the beginning, a narcissistic woman may focus on justifying the distance. She may remember the flaws, the disagreements, the moments that allowed her to believe she was right to dismiss the relationship. But as the emotional noise fades and the present becomes less satisfying than expected, memory begins to rearrange itself. Gradually, different moments rise to the surface. The times he showed patience instead of anger. The times he stayed when leaving would have been easier. The quiet loyalty that once seemed ordinary now appears in a different light. Psychologically, this is the mind attempting to reconcile two realities. The belief that the relationship was easily replaceable, and the growing sense that something meaningful was lost. And that tension forces reflection. In many cases, the past begins to look far more valuable than it once did when it was still present. Because the mind has a curious habit, it often minimizes what it has today, but it magnifies what it can no longer reach. Eventually, a final transformation occurs in the way she perceives the man she once overlooked. When he was always present, available, patient, and willing to engage, his presence felt predictable. Predictability, in the mind of someone driven by ego and validation, can easily be mistaken for a lack of value. what is always there begins to feel ordinary. But when that man truly moves forward with his life, something changes. He is no longer reacting, no longer orbiting around her emotional world. He becomes distant not through hostility, but through indifference. And this is where the psychological shift becomes powerful. Human attention is often drawn toward what feels uncertain or out of reach. The man who once seemed easy to access now appears independent, self-directed, and unaffected. This independence creates a kind of mystery. Questions begin to surface. Has he changed? Is he happier without me? Has he become someone I no longer understand? Paradoxically, the moment he stops trying to prove his worth is the moment his value becomes most visible. His absence creates space for curiosity, and curiosity can slowly turn into fixation. Because when someone you once controlled becomes someone you can no longer influence, the mind begins to chase what the ego once dismissed. And that is the strange truth of human nature. Sometimes the moment you stop being pursued is the moment you finally become unforgettable.